In 1987, a respected pastor from a small mountain town in Colorado vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine spiritual retreat in the Andes. Father Michael Torres had been the cornerstone of St. Catherine's Church for over 2 decades, a man whose weathered hands had blessed countless marriages and whose gentle voice had guided troubled souls through their darkest hours. The congregation waited for weeks, their prayers echoing through the empty sanctuary like whispers in a tomb. But the mountain had swallowed their shepherd whole. His disappearance left a wound in the community that never quite healed, a scar that grew deeper with each passing winter. The official investigation concluded that he had fallen into a crevasse during a sudden storm, his body forever entombed in the ancient ice. 30 years later, Sarah Torres Martinez sat in her cramped Denver apartment, surrounded by the debris of a life she no longer recognized. The granddaughter of the vanished pastor, she had spent her adult years running from the shadow of his memory, trading her childhood faith for the harsh realities of investigative journalism. Her grandfather's disappearance had carved a hollow space in her chest, a void that no amount of success or recognition could fill. She had become a woman who hunted truth for others while fleeing from her own past, her press credentials a shield against the questions that haunted her dreams. The bottle of whiskey on her desk reflected the amber glow of her laptop screen, both serving as companions in her self-imposed exile from grace. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in brown paper and bearing no return address. Inside, nestled in protective foam, lay a digital camera, scratched, weathered, but miraculously intact after decades in the ice. The accompanying note from the Andean Research Institute was brief. Found at 18,000 feet elevation, Cordillera Blanca. Belonged to Michael Torres. Thought you should have it. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the device, feeling the weight of frozen time in her palms. The camera's metal surface was cold against her skin, as if it still carried the memory of the mountain's embrace. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, gentle and certain, speaking of faith that could move mountains, a faith she had lost the day he never came home. The images loaded slowly, each photograph a window into the past that made her breath catch in her throat. Her grandfather's face appeared on the screen, older than she remembered, lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too many burdens. He was documenting something, the shots methodical and careful, each frame capturing details of a remote valley she didn't recognize. The final images showed him setting up camp near what appeared to be an ancient stone structure, its weathered walls covered in symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light of his campfire. In the last photograph, taken just before the camera's battery died, she could see the fear in his eyes, not the fear of the mountain, but of something far more human and infinitely more dangerous. As Sarah stared at the final image, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the background, barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight, stood the silhouette of another person, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who had been watching her grandfather in his final moments. The official reports had insisted he was alone, that his death was a tragic accident born of nature's indifference. But this photograph told a different story, one that suggested Father Michael Torres hadn't simply vanished into the ice. He had been silenced by human hands, his truth buried beneath decades of lies and snow. The camera fell from her numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor like a gunshot in the silence of her apartment. And Sarah knew that her grandfather's ghost would never rest until she uncovered what he had died trying to expose. The flight to Colorado felt like a journey backward through time, each mile bringing Sarah closer to the ghosts she had spent years trying to outrun. The small mountain town of Cedar Falls hadn't changed much since her childhood. The same narrow streets lined with weathered storefronts, the same looming presence of St. Catherine's Church with its bell tower reaching toward the clouds like a desperate prayer. She rented a room at the Pineview Inn, the same place where visiting relatives had stayed for her grandfather's memorial service, and tried to ignore the way the elderly clerk's eyes widened with recognition. The town held its memories close, like secrets whispered in confession, and Sarah could feel the weight of unspoken questions following her down every familiar street. The mountain air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the echo of her grandfather's voice telling her bedtime stories about angels who lived in the clouds. St. Catherine's Church stood exactly as she remembered, its stone walls blackened by decades of harsh winters, and its stained glass windows casting rainbow fragments across the empty pews. Father Rodriguez, the current pastor, was a nervous man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely surprised by her visit. "Your grandfather was a saint," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed these words many times. "The whole community still feels his loss." But Sarah noticed how his hands fidgeted with his rosary when she mentioned the camera, how his gaze flickered toward the altar as if seeking divine guidance for a conversation he clearly didn't want to have. The church felt different now, smaller, somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She could almost see her younger self sitting in the front pew, trusting and innocent, believing that good men didn't simply disappear into the darkness without reason. The church archives were kept in a basement room that smelled of old paper and secrets, boxes upon boxes of records dating back to the town's founding. Father Rodriguez had reluctantly given her access after she showed him the camera, his face pale as he recognized the device his predecessor had carried on that final journey. Sarah spent hours combing through financial records, correspondence, and meeting minutes, searching for any clue that might explain why her grandfather had felt compelled to make that fatal trip to the Andes. The numbers told a story of their own unexplained deposits into the church's accounts, mysterious donations that seemed to come from nowhere, and careful notations in her grandfather's handwriting that suggested he had been tracking something significant. One particular entry caught her attention. CF Mining Corp. Requires immediate investigation, souls at stake. The discovery of her grandfather's personal journal, hidden behind a false panel in his old office, felt like finding a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of time. His handwriting, once so familiar from birthday cards and Christmas letters, now seemed to pulse with urgency and fear. The entries from his final months painted a picture of a man wrestling with a terrible discovery, someone who had stumbled upon a truth that powerful people would kill to keep buried. "The mining permits were fraudulent," he had written. "They're poisoning the water supply of 3 villages, hundreds of children. I have to stop this." The journal detailed meetings with environmental scientists, conversations with government officials, and a growing sense that his investigation was putting him in mortal danger. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, contained a single chilling line. "They know what I know. God help me. They know." As Sarah read her grandfather's words, she felt the familiar burn of tears she had refused to shed for 3 decades. The man she had idolized wasn't just a victim of nature's cruelty. He was a martyr who had died trying to save innocent lives from corporate greed and environmental destruction. The camera he had carried wasn't just documenting a spiritual retreat. It was gathering evidence of a crime that reached into the highest levels of local government and industry. She could picture him alone in that remote valley, knowing that death was approaching but determined to capture proof of the corruption that was killing children thousands of miles away. The weight of his sacrifice pressed down on her chest like a physical burden, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she had inherited not just his camera, but his mission. The mountain had kept his secret for 30 years. But now it was time for the truth to thaw and flow like meltwater toward the sea. The Cedar Falls Public Library had become Sarah's second home, its quiet corners and dusty archives serving as a sanctuary where she could piece together the fragments of her grandfather's investigation. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a woman, in her 70s, who had worked there since before Sarah was born, and her eyes held the knowing look of someone who had seen too much to ever be truly surprised. "Your grandfather used to come here often in those final months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would sit right there by the window, reading everything he could find about mining operations and water contamination. He seemed so troubled." Mrs. Chen led Sarah to a back room where special collections were kept, her arthritic fingers dancing across yellowed newspaper clippings and government documents that told the story of Cedar Falls Mining Corporation's rise to power. The company had arrived in the 1980s with promises of jobs and prosperity, but the reality was far darker than anyone had imagined. The newspaper archives painted a picture of systematic environmental destruction disguised as economic development. CF Mining had been extracting precious metals from the mountains using techniques that left behind toxic waste, chemicals that seeped into groundwater and traveled downstream to indigenous communities in Peru and Bolivia. Sarah found article After article documenting mysterious illnesses in remote villages, children born with birth defects, and water sources that glowed with an otherworldly phosphorescence. Her grandfather had been building a case, collecting evidence that would have exposed not just the company's crimes, but the complicity of local officials who had been paid to look the other way. The paper trail led to some of the most respected names in town: the mayor, the county commissioner, even the bishop who had overseen the diocese. These were men who sat in church pews every Sunday, who spoke of moral duty and Christian values, while profiting from the suffering of the innocent. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered a series of photographs tucked inside an old environmental impact report. The images showed the same stone structure from her grandfather's camera, but these were taken months earlier, and from a different angle. The ruins weren't just ancient ceremonial sites. They were strategically positioned to monitor water flow patterns and document contamination levels. Her grandfather had been using archaeological sites as cover for his environmental investigation, meeting with local activists and scientists who were risking their lives to expose the truth. The photographs also revealed something else: the unmistakable figure of James Morrison, Cedar Falls' current mayor, standing beside CF mining executives in what appeared to be a coordination meeting. Morrison had been a young city councilman in 1987, ambitious and hungry for power, and these images suggested he had been involved in the cover-up from the very beginning. The temperature in the library seemed to drop as Sarah realized the scope of the conspiracy her grandfather had uncovered. This wasn't just about corporate greed. It was about the systematic betrayal of everything he had believed in. The men he had trusted, the institutions he had served, the very community he had devoted his life to protecting had all been corrupted by money and power. She could imagine his horror as he connected the dots, understanding that his own bishop might have been involved in silencing his investigation. The stone structure in the photographs wasn't just a hiding place. It was a tomb, chosen specifically because its remote location would ensure that both the evidence and the investigator would disappear without a trace. The mountain had been both witness and accomplice to a murder disguised as an accident. As Sarah gathered the documents into a pile, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and determination, she noticed that someone had been watching her from the library's main desk. A young man in an expensive suit had been pretending to read a magazine, but his eyes kept drifting to her table, his face pale with the kind of tension that comes from carrying guilty knowledge. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away and hurried toward the exit, his footsteps echoing through the library like a countdown to something terrible. Mrs. Chen appeared at Sarah's elbow, her expression grave as she watched the man disappear into the afternoon shadows. "That's David Morrison," she whispered. "The mayor's son. He's been asking questions about you ever since you came to town." The old woman's fingers closed around Sarah's wrist like a vice, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Child, you need to be very careful. Some secrets in this town have been buried so deep that digging them up might bury you too." The drive to the remote valley where her grandfather had made his final camp felt like a pilgrimage through a landscape of memories and ghosts. Sarah had rented a four-wheel drive vehicle and hired a local guide named Miguel, a weathered man whose indigenous features spoke of generations spent reading the mountain's moods. He had known her grandfather, had even met with him during those final weeks when the pastor was gathering evidence about the mining operation's impact on downstream communities. Father Torres was different from other Americans, Miguel said as they navigated the winding mountain roads. He listened. He cared about people he had never met, children whose names he would never know. The guide's voice carried the weight of loss, and Sarah understood that her grandfather's death had rippled through communities far beyond Cedar Falls. The mountain air grew thinner with each mile, and she could feel the presence of the ancient peaks pressing down on them like the weight of unfinished business. The stone structure from the photographs materialized through the morning mist like a memory-given form, its weathered walls standing in silent testimony to secrets that had been buried for 3 decades. The site was exactly as her grandfather had documented it, a circular arrangement of stones that had once served as a ceremonial platform for pre-Columbian peoples, now transformed into a monument to modern betrayal. Sarah could see the exact spot where he had set up his camera, the place where he had spent his final night documenting evidence that would have changed everything. The ground beneath her feet felt sacred and cursed at the same time, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for truth to finally break through the surface like a mountain spring. Miguel began unpacking their equipment with the reverence of someone who understood that they were walking on ground, made holy by sacrifice. The metal detector's steady beeping led them to a spot approximately 50 yards from the stone circle, where something substantial was buried beneath decades of sediment and mountain debris. Sarah's heart pounded as they began to dig, each shovelful of earth bringing them closer to answers that had been frozen in time. The first object they uncovered was a leather satchel, its surface preserved by the cold and wrapped in waterproof material that spoke of her grandfather's careful preparation. Inside, they found documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. Correspondence between CF mining executives and local officials, scientific reports detailing the extent of the water contamination, and photographs of diseased children that would have served as devastating evidence in any court of law. These weren't just smoking guns. They were weapons of mass destruction aimed at the heart of a conspiracy that had claimed innocent lives for profit. The second discovery was even more damning. A small recording device wrapped in protective plastic, its battery long dead, but its memory intact. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the device, knowing that it contained her grandfather's voice, speaking across the decades, his final testimony preserved in digital amber. The recordings would have to wait until they returned to town, but she could almost hear his words already, the careful cadence of a man who knew he was speaking to posterity. Miguel's expression was grim as he helped her carefully package the evidence, his weathered hands treating each item like a sacred relic. "Your grandfather was a brave man," he said quietly. "But bravery alone is not enough when you are fighting demons who wear the faces of angels." The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air announced that their presence had not gone unnoticed. Sarah looked up to see an aircraft bearing the CF mining logo circling overhead, its occupants no doubt reporting their location to people who had killed once to keep these secrets buried. Miguel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle he carried, for protection against mountain predators. But they both knew that the most dangerous predators in these mountains wore three-piece suits and carried briefcases instead of claws. The helicopter circled twice more before disappearing beyond the ridge, leaving behind only the echo of its passage and the certain knowledge that their time was running out. Sarah clutched the satchel against her chest, feeling the weight of 30 years of buried truth, and made a silent promise to her grandfather's memory that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The mountain had kept his secrets long enough. Now it was time for the world to hear what he had died trying to say. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading arrived with the subtlety of an avalanche, beginning with a polite knock on her hotel room door at precisely 11 o'clock that evening. Mayor James Morrison stood in the hallway accompanied by two men in expensive suits, their faces carrying the kind of professional neutrality that spoke of corporate damage control and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect their interests. Morrison's smile was warm and paternal, the practiced expression of a politician who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing trustworthy, while betraying every principle he claimed to hold dear. "Ms. Torres Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the honey-sweet tone of a snake oil salesman. "I understand you've been asking questions about your grandfather's unfortunate accident. Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately, away from the prying eyes of a small town that has finally begun to heal from that terrible tragedy." The hotel's conference room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, its bland corporate furniture and beige walls serving as a backdrop for what Sarah knew would be either her grandfather's final vindication or her own destruction. Morrison sat across from her with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions, flanked by his corporate allies who introduced themselves with titles that meant nothing and handshakes that felt like threats. "Your grandfather was a troubled man in his final months," Morrison began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining reality to a child. "He had developed some rather paranoid delusions about the mining operation, accusations that had no basis, in fact. We tried to help him, to get him the medical attention he clearly needed, but he refused to listen to reason. The lies flowed from his lips like honey from a broken jar, sweet and sticky, and utterly poisonous." Sarah's response came in the form of evidence that cut through Morrison's carefully crafted fiction like a blade through silk. She placed the recovered documents on the conference table one by one, each photograph and scientific report a nail in the coffin of his carefully maintained innocence. The mayor's face transformed as he recognized the materials, his practiced smile melting away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. These documents prove that CF Mining was systematically poisoning water supplies in 3 countries, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. They show payments to local officials, falsified environmental reports, and cover-ups that cost hundreds of lives. My grandfather didn't die in an accident. He was murdered because he was going to expose all of you. The room fell silent except for the sound of Morrison's breathing, which had become shallow and rapid as he realized that his past had finally caught up with him. The mayor's mask slipped completely as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. You have no idea what you're dealing with, little girl. Your grandfather was a naive fool who thought he could fight forces beyond his understanding. He paid the price for his arrogance, just as you will if you continue down this path. One of the suited men placed a briefcase on the table, its contents clearly visible through the open lid. Stacks of cash that represented more money than Sarah had ever seen in one place. This is enough to set you up for life, Morrison continued. Take it, walk away, and let the dead rest in peace. Your grandfather's crusade died with him in that mountain, and it should stay buried. The offer hung in the air like a physical presence, a test of her character that would determine whether she would honor her grandfather's memory or become another casualty of the corruption that had consumed her hometown. Sarah's answer came, not in words but in action, her hand moving to the small recording device she had activated upon entering the room. Morrison's eyes widened as he realized that their entire conversation had been captured, that his confession and attempted bribery were now preserved for posterity. The corporate lawyers sprang into action, one lunging for the device while the other moved to block the door. But Sarah had anticipated their reaction. She pressed a button on her phone, and the recording began streaming live to a secure server. Her grandfather's story and their confessions spreading across the internet like wildfire. You killed him because he was going to expose your crimes, she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. But you made one mistake. You assumed that death could silence the truth. My grandfather may be gone, but his voice will never be silenced again. The room erupted in chaos as the men realized that their carefully constructed world of secrets and lies was crumbling around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. The arrest of Mayor Morrison and his co-conspirators sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls that registered on every level of society, from the coffee shops where old-timers gathered to discuss the weather, to the boardrooms where corporate executives scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Federal agents descended on the town like a plague of justice, their badges and warrants serving as keys to unlock 3 decades of carefully guarded secrets. Sarah stood in the St. Catherine's Church Cemetery, her grandfather's headstone finally, bearing the inscription, Martyr for Truth, instead of the generic platitudes that had marked his grave for so many years. The media circus that surrounded the arrests had been exhausting, but she had endured every interview and deposition with the knowledge that her grandfather's sacrifice was finally being acknowledged. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and redemption, and she could almost hear his voice whispering approval across the divide between life and death. The trials that followed were a masterclass in the slow grinding of justice, each day bringing new revelations about the scope of the conspiracy and the depth of the betrayal. Environmental scientists testified about the extent of the contamination, their charts and graphs painting a picture of devastation that stretched across 3 countries and decades of willful neglect. Families from affected communities traveled thousands of miles to tell their stories, their testimonies serving as living proof of the human cost of corporate greed. Sarah found herself serving as both witness and advocate, her grandfather's evidence providing the foundation for prosecutions that would ultimately result in prison sentences for 12 officials and $1 billion settlement for the affected communities. The courtroom became a cathedral of truth, and every verdict felt like a prayer answered after years of silence. The healing process began slowly, like ice melting in the spring sun, as the community of Cedar Falls confronted the reality of what had been done in their name. St. Catherine's Church underwent its own transformation, with Father Rodriguez leading a congregation-wide examination of conscience that resulted in the establishment of a memorial fund for the victims of the mining operation. Sarah found herself drawn back to the pews of her childhood, not out of blind faith but out of a deeper understanding of her grandfather's belief that divine justice sometimes required human hands to do the work. The stained glass windows seemed brighter now, their colors more vivid, as if the truth had washed away layers of spiritual grime that had accumulated over the decades. The church bells rang with a clarity that seemed to carry her grandfather's voice on the wind, calling the faithful to a higher standard of moral courage. The final pilgrimage to the mountain where her grandfather had made his last stand felt like a completion of a circle that had been broken for 30 years. Sarah returned to the stone structure with Miguel and a small group of survivors from the affected communities, their presence transforming the site from a monument to death into a celebration of life and justice. They held a ceremony that blended Christian prayers with indigenous traditions, honoring both the ancient peoples who had built the structure and the modern martyr who had died defending their descendants. The mountain seemed to exhale as they spoke, as if it had been holding its breath for 3 decades and could finally release the burden of secrets it had carried. Sarah placed a small plaque beside the stone circle, its inscription reading simply, "Father Michael Torres. He spoke truth to power and gave his life for justice." The transformation in Sarah's own life was perhaps the most miraculous aspect of the entire ordeal, as she found herself rebuilding not just her relationship with faith but her understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. She established the Father Michael Torres Foundation, dedicated to supporting investigative journalism that exposed environmental crimes and corporate corruption. Her grandfather's camera became a symbol of the organization, its image appearing on letterhead and websites as a reminder that truth could survive even the deepest freeze. The work was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but Sarah approached it with the same unwavering commitment that had driven her grandfather to make his final journey into the mountains. She had learned that faith was not about blind belief, but about the courage to act on principle even when the cost was everything you held dear. The mountain had taught her that some secrets are too important to stay buried, and that the truth, like water, will always find a way to flow toward the light.